Hello, class. Okay, it's me. I'm back. Let's continue with the slideshow that we were working through. I'm going to put myself in the corner. We were talking about the way in which utilitarianism widens the scope of the moral community by showing that non-human animals, since they are capable of experiencing pain and pleasure, deserve our moral attention, right? They have moral status. They matter from a moral point of view, which is another way of saying we have responsibilities to non-human animals. And the utilitarian can explain why. So we were talking about that at the end of the first part. So I'm going to put myself here in the bottom and begin where we left off here with this next slide about the powerful appeal of the slippery slope argument. And this is, for some, this is a part of the attraction of utilitarianism. For others, it is one of the problems with utilitarianism. That many utilitarians appeal to the slippery slope argument to defend their moral conclusions, right? So it's a style of reasoning that is aimed at minimizing catastrophic future harms. And there's the page numbers to the chapter 10 from Schaefer-Landau, where he talks about this. And we have an image of the slippery slope where, you start out by taking a small step. It triggers a chain of events that leads to a very bad negative outcome. So the small step doesn't look like it will cause much harm, but the thought is that if we do this one thing, it will trigger a chain of events that will lead to a very, very bad thing in the future. You'll find this style of reasoning in many public debates. For example, the debate about whether to legalize marijuana. Some would argue that while legalizing marijuana is a small step toward relieving the suffering of many people who want to use it to relieve pain, right, for medical purposes, it is a small step also towards eliminating certain unjust practices in our criminal justice system, where many people are incarcerated for petty drug possession crimes and put in jail, and all they're doing is using marijuana, which is, you could argue, no more harmful than smoking a cigarette or having a beer, both of which are legal for people above a certain age. And so the argument in defense of legalizing marijuana is that it would relieve a lot of suffering and solve some problems in our justice system. But someone could argue that, look, once you allow people to smoke marijuana legally, which looks like a small step in the right direction, this will trigger the legalization of all narcotic substances, and that will have a catastrophic impact on society. So it's one thing to legalize marijuana, but what if we start legalizing cocaine and heroin and all these harder drugs? And if all of those drugs are legal, it would be really, 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 really bad. Okay, so that's an argument against legalizing marijuana. And it has a utilitarian structure because it points to the really bad future effects of taking this small step now. Similar arguments have been made against legalizing euthanasia or doctor-assisted suicide, right, that it could, while it might solve small problems here and look innocuous enough, it would, if we change that practice, if we legalize that practice in the medical profession, it would have really catastrophic effects in the future. Okay, so if that style of reasoning appeals to you, that suggests that you think in a utilitarian way. Like what kinds of restrictions should we place on our decisions now to avoid catastrophic harms in the future? However, many people feel that the slippery slope argument is usually fallacious. It involves a logical fallacy that occurs when a person is making an argument, right? Because oftentimes not enough adequate evidence is given to support the conclusion that if we take one small step now, that this will trigger a chain of events that will cause a terrible outcome in the future, right? It sounds like a plausible thing to say, but often the evidence is not there to support that conclusion. And so the slippery slope argument is fallacious in the sense that it's bad reasoning, right? So many people feel that slippery slope reasoning does not support any conclusions about what to do. And so this would not be a kind of an attraction of utilitarianism, but a problem for the theory that it tends to appeal to a fallacious style of reasoning. Okay. Okay. So this leads to difficulties for utilitarianism, right? This is chapter 10, right? I just sort of pointed to one potential difficulty, that utilitarians tend to make slippery slope style arguments a lot of the time. And those arguments, while those arguments can be legitimate, right, they're often based on inadequate evidence. So, for example, what's the evidence that legalizing marijuana will lead to the legalization of cocaine, right, or harder drugs? There's not a lot of evidence that that will happen. Okay, so we don't have reason to worry about that. So then that wouldn't be an argument against legalizing marijuana if we have no reason to expect that it will lead to this catastrophic consequence in the future. Okay, here's some other difficulties through utilitarianism, though. These are common objections, and he talks about these on page 143 to 154 in chapter 10 of the Fundamentals of Ethics. For one thing, utilitarianism seems to assume that we have a way of measuring our well-being, and those measurements are typically characterized in terms of amounts of pleasure and pain, or the balance of happiness over misery, which is thought to be a measurable quality. It's not clear, though, that when you really look at the view carefully, that we do have a standard of measurement for a person's well-being that is useful in guiding our decision-making. A person's well-being can be measured in many different ways, as many of you have talked about in some of your writings. And this poses a potential problem for the utilitarian, because if we have no standard by which we can measure a person's well-being, then we have no standard by which we can determine the difference between right and wrong, since that's the basis of the utilitarian distinction between right and wrong. How much well-being an action promotes, right, determines its moral value. But if we can't measure the well-being in any objective way, then we don't have an objective foundation for morality anymore. Because that's a problem, a kind of foundational issue. Perhaps there's ways of resolving that. Perhaps there are ways of sort of characterizing what the standard of measurement is in a way that we can all pretty much agree upon, but that's a debate that you could have. Others would argue that it's too demanding. It asks us to sacrifice too much of our self-interest for the sake of the public good, or it asks us to focus too much on the public good and not enough on our own private good, or too much on public welfare and not enough on our personal lives, right, and our personal commitments. So, for example, we talked about the article by Singer, right? It seems to require that we be saints in our lives, that we give up all of our luxuries and comforts for the sake of preventing global famine. That's one example. Now, while that would be a really good thing for many people to do, right, it's too much. A moral theory shouldn't require it of us. It should require that we are minimally decent to each other, and not to, for example, not do anything to make the lives of the less advantaged worse. Right? So I certainly shouldn't be exploiting poor people or making their lives worse. But from a moral point of view, do I really have a moral duty to improve the lives of people who are suffering from conditions of poverty in foreign countries, right? Or, right, do I get to focus on other types of projects that enrich my life? Well, I mean, I think one could argue that as long as you're not impoverishing more people by doing that, right, you don't have any maybe special moral duty to prevent and minimize conditions of poverty. I don't know, that's a debate. But so that would be one example of the way in which it's too demanding. But more generally, the thought is that it asks us to, whenever we act, consider the public good before we consider our private good. And that may be too demanding. A third potential problem is that it's too impartial. And this is related. Right? Sometimes partiality seems to be what is required of us, right? When we are thinking about our relationship with friends and family, right? Sometimes we have special responsibilities to our friends, to our family, and that seems okay from a moral point of view, that we give preference to, right, the well-being of our friends and family over the well-being of strangers. Sometimes that seems appropriate. And maybe utilitarianism asks us to be too impartial. So one classic example is a lifeboat example, right? Where you are on a ship that's going down and you end up on a lifeboat, and some of the people fall out of the lifeboat and they're drowning, and you could swim in one direction or the other to save people. Well, if you swim to the left, you could save 5 strangers. If you swim to the right, you could save your son. You can't save both, right? So most would argue that from a moral point of view, I get to be partial to my son, even though it would mean saving fewer lives, right? From a utilitarian perspective, I have a responsibility to promote as much happiness for as many people as I can. I could save more lives by swimming to the left, but that would mean letting my son drown. And that seems wrong from a moral point of view. It seems like that's a case where I get to be partial. I get to put my son's welfare ahead of the welfare of these 5 strangers. Or at least it's okay for me to do that. To ask anything more of me would be to require that I act like a saint. Okay, so there's that problem. And then lastly, we talked about this, it might be too flexible a theory, because utilitarianism suggests that there is nothing that is intrinsically right or wrong. No action is intrinsically right or wrong. Any action could, under certain circumstances, promote more welfare or for more people, could promote more utility. And that would at least give us a moral reason to consider doing it. Right, so torture is the classic example. Right, from the utilitarian perspective, torturing someone is not intrinsically wrong. Right, it is almost always wrong because it almost always promotes unnecessary misery. But in some cases, it might prevent future deaths. Right, if we're torturing the person who's connected to the terrorist network, who can give us information about how to prevent an act of terrorism in the future, saving many lives. Right, so in that case, it looks like we might be morally permitted to torture for the sake of saving thousands of lives, right? So that's the utilitarian would make that argument, okay? That kind of flexibility is needed in order for us to know, in order for us to act in the right, in order for us to act morally, we have to be flexible. But someone might argue, no, that's the wrong way to go, right? Torture is always wrong, right? And should be. And we should, and utilitarianism is too flexible. It gives us a way of justifying actions that are intrinsically wrong. Okay, that's a problem for some. Okay. Coming to the end of this part of the video, the problem of injustice leads to the Kantian approach. Okay. So what is the problem? And this is the biggest problem I think that he considers. Right. There are some actions that are deeply unjust, but that might promote more utility, right, or promote good outcomes. And the problem is that utilitarianism has a hard time condemning these types of actions, right, that seem unjust. Why? Because they seem also to promote a good outcome. And so the utilitarian has a hard time explaining why they're wrong. So you can look at the 2 examples of vicarious and exemplary punishment on page 155 and 156 and ask yourself, are these actions unjust? And does that all by itself show that they're wrong? Right? That's the suggestion that Schaefer-Landau makes. And then can the utilitarian explain the wrongness of those actions? If not, then that's a problem for utilitarianism. Right? Okay. And so we'll shift to this in the next video. But there's 3 sort of possible solutions to the problem of injustice. And I'll return to this in the 3rd part of the video. One potential solution is to say, look, happiness, welfare, utility is not the only thing that has intrinsic value. Justice also has intrinsic value. And so we should do what we can to promote more of that. That's one potential solution that the utilitarian could propose, but it seems like that undermines the whole point of utilitarianism, which is to say that there's only one thing that has intrinsic value: happiness, welfare, utility. Okay, so let me pause here, and we'll come back to this issue in the final video. Okay, that's all for now.